Most people do not know the difference between feeling and carrying. They think if something moves through them deeply, it must belong to them. And if it belongs to them, they must manage it alone. That mistake creates entire lives of confusion, because borrowed sorrow begins wearing the face of identity and unspoken tension begins masquerading as truth. The Driftway Pools exist because emotional life becomes dangerous, when a being loses the ability to distinguish what is passing through from what is actually rooted within. The pools are not built for escape, and they are not built for cleansing in the shallow sense people prefer. They do not wash emotion away so that consciousness can return to some sterilized version of peace. They create a field where feeling can reveal its real shape without being forced into immediate interpretation, performance, or action. That distinction matters because many people do not suffer from emotion itself. They suffer from what they do the moment emotion arrives. The first pressure inside the driftway field is simple and brutal. It removes the demand to know what to do before the emotional current has become legible. This unsettles the ordinary self because action often functions as anesthesia. Advice, explanation, self-control, and even spiritual language can all become fast exits from direct contact. The pools interrupt that exit pattern by slowing response without muting intensity, and that makes many people feel exposed long before they feel relieved. What emerges first in such exposure is not wisdom but contamination anxiety. A being begins noticing how often it has mistaken absorption for compassion and numbness for maturity. It starts seeing the quiet panic beneath its own helpfulness, the way it reaches to fix because it cannot tolerate the heat of unprocessed feeling nearby. The driftway field does not accuse this pattern. It simply removes the illusion that it was ever the same thing as care. This is why the pools are dangerous to anyone invested in emotional control as a form of virtue. They reveal that much of what passes for composure is only a polished refusal to be affected. They also reveal that much of what passes for empathy is an undisciplined merging that leaves both beings more confused than before. Between those two distortions lies a capacity few people are taught to cultivate, and that capacity is the real doorway the pools are guarding. To stand at that doorway, a being must begin learning that feeling can be held without being adopted. Sorrow can be witnessed without becoming private property. Fear can be recognized without being obeyed. Shame can be approached without being made into a throne. The Driftway Pools do not teach this by concept first, but by atmosphere, because some truths can only become believable when the system survives them in real time. The second vector begins where emotion stops being a private event and becomes a relational current. Most suffering inside relationships does not come from what is felt, but from how quickly feeling is converted into role. One person becomes the holder, another becomes the overflow, another becomes the rescuer, another becomes the silence. After enough repetition, nobody is relating anymore. They are only maintaining positions inside an emotional weather system that no one has actually learned to read. The Driftway Pools break that pattern by refusing role assignment as the first answer to intensity. In their field, one being can ache without making another responsible for carrying the ache away. Another being can remain present without turning presence into silent absorption or defensive explanation. This feels unnatural at first because most people have been taught that closeness means shared flooding or mutual management. The pools expose how costly that teaching has been without giving the comfort of instant replacement. A quiet resistance appears here that sounds almost compassionate. It says that if you do not absorb what another person is feeling, then you must not really love them. It says that if you remain separate while staying present, then your care must be incomplete or guarded. The driftway field dismantles that lie slowly by letting beings witness what happens when absorption is removed. What remains is not indifference. What remains is cleaner contact. Cleaner contact changes the emotional economy of relationship in ways many personalities initially dislike. It removes the hidden rewards of being needed for rescue. It removes the moral superiority attached to being the strongest container in the room. It removes the secret entitlement behind emotional collapse that assumes someone else must reorganize themselves around your pain. Under driftway conditions, Those habits stop feeling romantic and start feeling structurally expensive. That structural expense is why some bonds weaken when this field becomes active. A connection built on mutual drowning we'll call clarity cold. A connection built on emotional dependence we'll call spaciousness abandonment. A connection built on silent resentment we'll call honest naming unnecessary conflict. The pools do not decide which bonds survive these pressures. They simply make the invisible costs visible enough that continuation without truth becomes harder to sustain. From there, a harder relational truth starts emerging. Real closeness does not require you to become porous to every current passing through another person. Real closeness requires that you remain available while retaining your own center. This sounds simple until it touches the places where being needed has become part of self-worth, or where emotional collapse has become the only reliable way to secure attention. The driftway field makes those arrangements impossible to romanticize once the deeper recognition has started. The third vector enters where emotional life becomes communal rather than personal or dyadic. Groups, families, movements, and spiritual communities all generate shared feeling climates whether they admit it or not. Most of them do not know how to metabolize those climates consciously, so they create customs instead. They create moods, taboos, tones of speech, permitted intensities, and subtle punishments that regulate what can be expressed without rupture. The result is not emotional intelligence. The result is collective weather management without actual collective feeling literacy. The driftway pools matter at this scale because they reveal the difference between atmosphere and truth. A community can feel warm while circulating suppression. It can feel serious while circulating fear. It can feel gentle while circulating unspoken coercion. Once the driftway current becomes active, beings begin noticing where group emotion has become performative, where tenderness is rewarded only if it stays convenient, and where conflict is being buried under language that sounds evolved but cannot carry reality. This is where the pools become politically dangerous in the deepest sense. Not because they produce rebellion as an identity, but because they make emotional distortion harder to organize around. A group that survives by keeping certain grief unnamed, certain anger disowned, or certain vulnerability privately punished will experience driftway presence as destabilizing. The field does not attack the group. It simply restores enough sensitivity that members can feel the hidden cost of their own participation. A new objection rises here, and it is stronger than the earlier ones because it speaks in the name of stability. It says that communities cannot survive if every feeling is given space, and that some emotional editing is simply the price of coherence. That objection contains truth just long enough to be persuasive. The driftway pools do not deny the need for form, timing, and boundary. They deny the fantasy that suppression and coherence are the same achievement. What they reveal instead is that communal coherence built on avoidance becomes brittle faster than anyone inside it wants to admit. The brittleness hides at first, because suppression often looks organized, and exhaustion often looks disciplined. But over time, the cost appears in stranger places, in flat joy, in performative agreement, in shallow belonging, in recurring eruptions that seem disproportionate only because the stored current was never named honestly. The pools do not create this hidden pressure. They interrupt the system that has been redistributing it. By this point, the three vectors have each exposed a different confusion. A being has confused feeling with ownership. Relationship has confused closeness with absorption, and community has confused stability with managed silence. The driftway field has not yet offered a final synthesis because premature synthesis would become another escape from contact. First, the false equivalences have to become expensive enough that the system stops trying to live on them. Only then can the deeper architecture begin showing itself without being recruited into old habits. That deeper architecture is not emotional freedom in the casual sense. It is a disciplined form of permeability that allows currents to move without stealing center from the one who feels them. The pools teach this first at the level of the body, where sensation is allowed to complete itself without immediate narrative capture. They teach it next at the level of relation, where presence remains steady without colonizing the emotion of the other. Finally, they teach it at the level of field, where a group can hold intensity without converting honesty into threat. Here the insight sharpens rather than softens. The goal was never to feel less. The goal was never to become untouchable, calm, or spiritually above emotional weather. The goal was to become accurate enough that what is yours can deepen without what is not yours hijacking your identity. Accuracy in feeling is rarer than intensity, and it is more demanding than numbness. The driftway pools are built for that demand. This is why beings often leave the pools less dramatic but more vulnerable. Drama had been doing the work of false coherence, and once it loses authority, the system no longer needs volume to feel real. What remains is not reduced aliveness but increased legibility. A person can say this grief is moving through me without needing to declare this grief is me. A person can say I can remain with your pain without promising I will drown beside you. That shift changes what healing even means. Healing stops being the project of reducing emotional heat to manageable levels and becomes the cultivation of truthful contact under pressure. Relief may still happen, but relief is no longer the highest proof of progress. Sometimes the deepest progress looks like staying present without stealing, collapsing, fixing, or disappearing. In the Driftway field, those capacities are worth more than comfort because they can sustain truth after comfort fails. So the pressure that remains unresolved is the one most beings try hardest to avoid. If you can no longer call absorption love, can no longer call control maturity, and can no longer call managed silence peace, then what exactly will your emotional life have to stop rewarding? The Driftway Pools do not answer that with a slogan. They leave you standing inside the more difficult possibility that real feeling was never the problem, and that the structures built to avoid real feeling may have been shaping far more of your life than you wanted to know. The first mistake after learning not to absorb everything is believing that distance is the same thing as discernment. Many people leave drowning behind and immediately build a colder room, then call that room maturity. They stop being overwhelmed, but they also stop being reached, and the relief feels convincing enough to be mistaken for wisdom. The Driftway Pools expose that substitution quickly, because numb order is still a corruption of feeling even when it looks cleaner than chaos. This is the first destabilization that Part 1 allowed to remain partially hidden. It was possible to hear that absorption is distortion and then quietly assume withdrawal must therefore be the cure. But the pools do not reward withdrawal any more than they reward flooding, because both strategies prevent accurate contact. One swallows the current whole, and the other refuses the current before it has revealed what it actually is. So the first vector of this movement is not emotional intensity but emotional refusal. Refusal has become sophisticated in people who think of themselves as clear, grounded, and finally beyond the volatility that once ruled them. They can name patterns, hold boundaries, and maintain function, yet still be organized by a quiet terror of being touched in any place they cannot immediately classify. The Driftway field makes this terror visible by removing the moral glamour that often surrounds emotional distance. A person can become very skilled at not drowning and still remain profoundly unavailable to truth. They can call their guardedness regulation, call their detachment peace, and call their reduced sensitivity wisdom. The self often celebrates this because it finally feels less vulnerable to the chaos it once could not survive. Yet the pools ask a harsher question than survival. Are you accurate? Or are you merely defended in a more elegant form? This question becomes unbearable for any identity built around being the stable one. The stable one is often needed by everyone and known by no one because usefulness can function as a substitute for contact. When driftway pressure enters, that role begins losing its hidden rewards. The person discovers that much of their steadiness was not spaciousness, but a disciplined avoidance of needing anything unpredictable from anyone else. A second resistance appears here and sounds practical enough to be persuasive. It says that openness is dangerous, that most people are carrying too much confusion, and that distance is simply the intelligent response to a noisy world. There is truth in the caution, but the driftway field separates caution from refusal with almost painful precision. It shows that true discernment remains reachable while defended distance becomes increasingly sterile, repetitive, and inwardly expensive. This leads into the second vector, which is the economy of emotional exchange rather than the posture of the individual self. Every culture teaches people how to trade feeling long before it teaches them how to witness it. Some trade distress for attention, some trade composure for trust, some trade collapse for permission, and some trade caretaking for value. The pools matter because they interrupt the economy itself rather than merely correcting one role inside it. In ordinary life, emotion gets monetized without anyone using that word. A child learns that certain forms of sadness produce closeness, while others produce irritation, and that lesson becomes a lifelong pattern. A partner learns that silence may buy temporary control while visible pain may buy temporary repair, and that pattern hardens into relationship law. A group learns which emotions increase belonging and which emotions threaten hierarchy. And soon the emotional market is running without anyone admitting it exists. Once the driftway current becomes active, these exchanges start feeling painfully legible. You begin noticing how often a conversation is not actually about truth, but about regulation through other people. You begin hearing when confession is a bid for rescue rather than a movement toward honesty. You begin seeing when calm is being used as social power instead of genuine grounded presence, and that recognition can make ordinary interactions feel strangely artificial. This does not mean every need becomes manipulation or every emotional request becomes suspect. That simplification would only create a new hardness wearing the face of discernment. The Driftway field is more exacting than that, because it asks whether the exchange restores reality or merely redistributes pressure. If a moment of sharing leaves both people less able to feel clearly, then the exchange may have produced relief while failing the deeper work. Relief is not the highest criterion here, and that is the next destabilization many people do not want. Entire therapeutic and spiritual cultures are built on the assumption that feeling better is reliable evidence of truth. But emotional markets are very good at creating local relief through distortion, especially when everyone involved prefers short-term stabilization over structural honesty. The pools do not reject relief, but they strip it of authority when it is purchased by confusion, role reinforcement, or borrowed coherence. That stripping changes the moral weather of relationship. The one who always comforts may no longer feel unquestionably good, because comfort can protect a system from the confrontation it most needs. The one who always confesses may no longer feel unquestionably brave, because confession can become a repetitive discharge that leaves underlying patterns intact. The one who always remains above the drama may no longer feel unquestionably wise, because distance can be the most socially rewarded distortion of them all. Now the third vector enters, and it is larger than the dyad. Larger than the household, larger than the community mood. Emotional currents do not only circulate between people. They shape timelines, institutions, decisions, and the future's entire systems become capable of entering. When enough unprocessed fear accumulates inside a structure, that structure starts calling its fear realism, then writes policy, culture, and identity from inside that misreading. This is why the Driftway Pools cannot be understood only as personal healing spaces. They are training fields for civilizational accuracy, because collective futures are built from emotional climates long before they are built from explicit ideas. A family organized by unnamed grief will call caution wisdom and wonder why joy feels suspicious. A nation organized by unprocessed humiliation will call domination security and wonder why peace keeps tasting like weakness. Most people underestimate this because they still assume decisions are driven primarily by thought. Thought matters, but thought usually serves the emotional climate that has already been normalized beneath it. The pools reveal that beneath many supposedly rational systems there is a swamp of unclaimed sorrow, old threat memory, and inherited defensiveness quietly shaping what becomes thinkable. When a culture cannot metabolize feeling, it mistakes reaction for necessity and calls its own limitation maturity. A third resistance appears here, and it is especially seductive because it sounds serious. It says that large systems cannot wait for emotional truth, that history moves through force, strategy, compromise, and necessity, not through subtle feeling climates. But the Driftway field does not romanticize emotion. It reveals that every system already moves through feeling climates whether it admits that fact or not, and denial only makes those climates more dangerous because they remain unnamed while determining everything. By this point, the three vectors have each undermined a different false cure. The first dismantled the belief that distance is the same thing as clarity. The second dismantled the belief that emotional exchange is truthful just because it produces closeness or relief. The third dismantled the belief that collective structures can remain rational while quietly organized by unprocessed affect. None of these exposures provides comfort on its own, and that discomfort must remain active because the mind will try to convert exposure into a new performance. That performance often takes the form of emotional purity. A person begins seeing through flooding, exchange economies, and collective distortion, then tries to become the one who is no longer contaminated by any of it. But that effort only recreates the old market at a subtler level, because purity becomes the new currency and detachment becomes the new prestige. The pools reject this immediately, because the point was never to become untouched. The point was to become truthful enough that touch no longer automatically turns into theft, collapse, or control. Truthful feeling is less glamorous than emotional intensity and less flattering than emotional superiority. It often looks slower than passion and less impressive than dramatic self-awareness. A truthful person can say I feel fear without making everyone else responsible for reducing it. A truthful person can remain with another person's sorrow without becoming their proof that the sorrow is justified or final. A truthful group can permit discomfort without immediately converting it into blame, rescue, or ideological certainty. Now the vectors can finally begin leaning toward each other instead of standing apart. The defended self, the relational economy, and the collective climate were never separate problems in the first place. They were different scales of the same distortion, each built from the inability to stay in contact with feeling without turning feeling into identity, trade, or law. The Driftway field does not solve that by removing intensity. It solves it by teaching a discipline of contact that can survive intensity without becoming ruled by it. This discipline changes what strength means. Strength is no longer the ability to suppress, no longer the ability to absorb, and no longer the ability to dominate the atmosphere through composure. It becomes the capacity to remain permeable without becoming porous, responsive without becoming recruited, and accurate without becoming cold. That is a much higher demand than the ordinary emotional models people inherit, which is why the pools feel like mercy to one part of the self and threat to another. The merciful part is obvious enough. A being no longer has to confuse its worth with what it can carry for others, no longer has to confuse its identity with whatever moved through it most recently. But the threatening part runs deeper. Because these pools expose how much of ordinary life has been organized around emotional distortion that still pays social dividends. They reveal that many roles, many bonds, and many forms of belonging survive precisely because accurate feeling has not yet been allowed to interrupt them. So the pressure that remains is not whether you can feel, you already can, and that was never the real issue. The pressure is whether you are willing to lose the rewards attached to emotional inaccuracy. Because there are rewards, and they are not small. There is reward in being needed, reward in collapsing, reward in performing wisdom, reward in maintaining atmospheres no one dares disturb. And the Driftway field quietly places all those rewards under judgment by reality itself. That judgment is not moralistic. It is consequential. The longer a life remains organized around inaccurate feeling, the more expensive intimacy becomes, the more exhausting leadership becomes, the more brittle coherence becomes, and the more appealing numbness starts to look. The pools are built for the moment when you become unwilling to pay that cost and equally unwilling to hide it behind beautiful language. Then the real work starts, not the work of feeling less, but the work of learning how to let truth move through emotion without letting emotion become the ruler of what is true.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.